Hey, Jeannie,
Yeah, Brew.
who's our guest on the Energy Nerd Show today?
Today we have Alice Napoleon, a principal associate at Synapse. Hi, Alice.
Hi, Bruce and Jeannie.
Good to see you. You have been doing a lot of interesting stuff at Synapse, and it's just been the past few years. You've been talking a lot about the future of gas.
Yeah, I did a lot of work in energy efficiency, and that led to some really interesting paths that I'm on now, looking more into future of natural gas utilities and their distribution systems, because a lot of that involves electrification and other alternative technologies, and some of which are also energy efficiency technologies. A lot of that is driven by state policies, where states have adopted carbon reduction targets all over the country, but Colorado and Maryland and New York and California, Rhode Island, lots of different states have adopted carbon reduction policies. And to meet those carbon reduction targets, there's going to need to be a large downsizing of the gas that we're currently consuming. And so gas utilities are trying to figure their way forward. And sometimes that seems to be with more of a status quo approach, where they are just looking to deliver commodities through pipes, their existing pipe networks. So they might be looking at renewable natural gas or hydrogen. And sometimes they're looking for, in more limited ways, they're looking at networked heat systems. So some states are pushing utilities to make improvements in their planning to try to figure out what their path forward is.
So Synapse typically works for states or organizations. What are you doing Synapse-wise on this question of the future of gas?
We work for a number of different clients. I've been doing work for consumer advocates as well as non-governmental organizations. So I do a lot of work for NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, and that's in particular in New York State. New York State is one of the states that has been making a lot of efforts towards improving gas utility planning, with the ultimate goal of trying to be consistent with New York's legislation, the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which calls for significant reductions in carbon emissions, 40% reduction economy-wide by 2030, and 85% by 2050 relative to 1990 levels. And in 2050, it's a net zero emissions policy. So that means that that last 15% can be met by other things like offsets. So that is economy-wide. It's the power sector as well as gas and transportation and all of those things. And so that's led to a little bit of confusion, because the gas utilities don't have a allocation of responsibility for those emissions reductions. And so they kind of are figuring that they have a bit of wiggle room, where it's not really reasonable to assume that they do have a lot of wiggle room. And the reason for that is that the building sector, which is a big part of the consumer base, the end use for these natural gas utilities, they have available and cost-effective alternatives to natural gas use, whereas some of the other sectors, transportation, it doesn't have quite the viable alternatives. In particular, if we're talking about heavy-duty vehicles and buses, like those are starting to come into their own with electrification and whatnot, but the alternatives are fewer and harder to come by for certain sectors. So industrial processes and feedstocks and transportation, heavy duty transportation.
So then the implications of these carbon goals for the electric utilities are load growth and more electricity sales, and as we electrify more and more end uses. But the implications for the gas company is presumably a shrinking of sales.
So a number of factors are coming into play that are reducing gas use. Energy efficiency, ongoing electrification. These things might be spurred by policy or just natural market transitions, but nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be very much disagreement that sales are going to go down. At the same time, it's not as clear whether the number of customers will go down. And that creates some problems for gas utilities and for gas ratepayers in general, where customers need to pay for the fixed costs of the utility system over a smaller number of therms, smaller number of sales. And so rates are going to go up, even if an individual customer isn't really changing its energy use.
So do you have any examples from New York, say, of where this set of scenarios can happen?
So this graph is based on some analysis that myself and my colleagues did, looking at some scenarios that National Grid New York put forward in its long-term gas plan. Long-term plans are required by the Public Service Commission, which is requiring all utilities to do these, and they submit initial plans, and parties are invited to submit comments on those initial plans. The utility is then able to revise its plan, and then we go through another cycle of steps where you get to the final plan. So this is a graph that we provided to NRDC, and NRDC included in its comments on the National Grid initial long-term plan. Oh, I wanted to say too, so this includes for National Grid, it's 3 LDCs, 3 local distribution companies. So that's Niagara Mohawk Power Corporation, Brooklyn Union Gas Company, otherwise known as KEDLI, and Keyspan Gas East Corporation, otherwise known as KEDLI. So this includes all 3 of those LDCs.
Those 3 companies, it looks like they combined, they have a rate base today of about $15 billion. And I can see the horizontal axis is the years going out into the future, but the rate base, that sounds like a lot of money, but can you explain what is a rate base?
Essentially, the rate base is investments, past and present, that the companies want to recover through rates on their customers.
It's the cost of those things, all of the gas infrastructure that they have already spent by that point in the year, and that's what they want to recover.
Right. And so when you see the rate base going up, that's because they're making new investments or proposing to make new investments. And so what we're looking at here is there's a few different scenarios. Some of them are based directly on National Grid's projections in its long-term plan. So there's the reference case. The Clean Energy Vision case is also National Grid's, and the accelerated electrification. However, we also looked at a customer defection case in which what would happen if customers were increasingly departing from the system while National Grid continued to make its investments on the system. And it's occurring to me, I need to share a different graph with you as well. So this one is showing what's happening over 2024 to 2050. This is our projection for fuel sales volume. So the reference doesn't see any kind of decline in fuel sales. It's not compliant with the CLCPA. The Clean Energy Vision sees somewhat of a decline in fuel sales, and that's because the Clean Energy Vision scenario seeks to increase the amount of heat pumps on the network in customers' homes. However, it seeks to use a strategy that is essentially like backup heating or tied to a specific ambient temperature, where once it gets to be something like 30 degrees, that the heat pumps will no longer be the main source of heat for the home, and that the furnace will kick on, or the existing natural gas system will kick on.
So it looks like in that scenario, the gas continues to serve about half of the heating load, and the heat pumps take up the other half.
Yes. And this is in contrast with an accelerated electrification scenario where there's more electrification, and the assumption is that heat pumps are sized to meet all of the load. An important thing to note with this is that heat pumps are extremely efficient compared to natural gas furnaces, where heat pumps can give something like 2 to 3 times the heat output of what they take in, or the energy that they're using. In contrast, gas furnaces are something, even the best ones, are something like 97% or 98%. So less than 1 compared to 200 or 300%.
So Alice, we've got these scenarios where some of them have continued growing investments in the gas system by the utility, and shrinking sales, and it seems like that combination could be disastrous for prices and customer rates per unit of gas, or per monthly in their monthly bills, right?
Yes, that's true. And so what we have here is a graph showing annual bill impacts of the natural gas system on natural gas customers. The clean energy vision, as you see, doesn't show a large revenue requirement, but a lot of that really relates to the assumptions that National Grid is making in its LTP about what costs are going to be going forward, and things that it didn't adequately take into consideration. So things like assuming that the amount of renewable natural gas that it wants to access on behalf of its customers, that it's available and that it's cost competitive, assuming that hydrogen fuel can be accessed in a cost-effective way and can be run through its pipes and can be operated in customers' end-use equipment. So, but that is a faulty assumption. Hydrogen can be corrosive to metal, so to the pipes, to older pipes inside the home or in National Grid's distribution system. So National Grid, along with most other utilities, is looking to replace its existing, what it calls leak-prone pipe on its system. These are older pipes that might be more likely to leak. Might be more likely to leak is really the operative word. So the utility is trying to replace them. However, that's just adding to rate base, right? And so that first graph that we saw, there's a lot of rate base going forward in that scenario. On the other hand, an alternative is accelerated electrification. So again, there are some questionable assumptions that National Grid made in that scenario for accelerated electrification. But what I wanted to show you here is the customer defection scenario is really designed to show what is the possible downside, what is the risk associated with the clean energy vision if it doesn't go the way that National Grid wants it to, really. And I would say that it is a little bit of wishful thinking, or a lot of wishful thinking on National Grid's part, that the clean energy vision is viable and is a likely scenario. The customer defection scenario that you see in red here shows if National Grid continues with its level of investment, for example, in replacing leak-prone pipe and other things to maintain its system as it is, without really seeking to downsize it, what are bills going to look like for customers? And it starts to get absurd really fast. And so, just illustrating the risk that is out there of things like stranded assets and whatnot if customers defect from the system. So it's called customer defection, but it's not even just that. If a substantial decline in sales could lead to something along the lines of this customer defection, where the utility is realistically not going to be able to recover its fixed cost through rates because customers aren't going to be able to afford it.
So Alice, what I'm getting as a takeaway is that the reference case is not viable for it's kind of continued emissions and the clean energy vision case here, the company's sort of like a plan or an idea of what they could do that's kind of a partial solution, but it doesn't really address the problem and has a lot of unrealistic assumptions. But proceeding on that plan could result in this kind of train wreck of increased investments. Look like they double over, another $15 billion over 10 or 12 years, combined with losing sales. And then next thing you know, customers have it's not a 10% increase in rates or a 50% increase. It's like a 10x increase in those out years. And so that's a real public policy train wreck. What can we do about it?
Well, to answer a slightly different question, the accelerated electrification case, as you see here, that also has some pretty steep impacts. And we are going to need to address those with policy. So there are a number of different things that states and their customers and utilities can consider. One thing that I would encourage states and jurisdictions to think about is who's going to be on the system once we start getting closer to 2050, right? Rates have already been rising for a number of years. And in fact, I do have some other graphs that I could show you where the cost of electrification has parity with gas in just a few years. That is already true for a number of cases, right? It's already true that in new construction, it's just more cost effective to use electric alternatives, heat pumps and whatnot. But for some retrofit situations, it still might not be cost competitive, but we have modeling to suggest that it is going to be competitive within a few years. And so as the economics of heating electrification continues to improve over time, we're going to see more and more customers trying to minimize their gas use and probably defecting from the system as well to avoid fixed charges, so customer charges. And who's going to be able to afford that? That's likely going to be people who have the financial resources to do this. And those hard to reach populations, those with limited income and limited assets, are going to have a harder time and are likely to be the ones who are still on the system as these rates go way up and bills are skyrocketing. And so one of the things that I encourage jurisdictions to do is to think about how can we get the low income folks and other disadvantaged communities off of the gas system first and to provide them with alternatives to continued gas use. There are other things that states might want to consider, things like securitization of the existing rate base, so that it's not all on the backs of gas customers. Such things really would need to be done carefully because you don't want to dampen enthusiasm. So if, for example, you're securitizing the gas rate base to recover it from electric customers, you want to be careful because you don't want to increase rates for electric customers to such an extent that they're discouraged from electrifying.
Also, securitization locks it in, so these costs, will be basically paid for by customers or citizens. Whereas, in a train wreck scenario like this, you'd think that maybe some of these obsolete costs are not used and useful and wouldn't be recovered in rates at all.
I totally agree with that, Bruce. And I think there does need to be some accountability with the current decision making that's coming out of gas utilities, where they really seem to want to stick their head in the sand, to use a metaphor that I know you like, Bruce. But, if you're in a hole, stop digging. So there are some policies that states can consider and that utilities should really be encouraging states to do. So for example, stop promoting the expansion of the gas system. New York is considering changing its interpretation of the law, which is colloquially known as the 100-foot rule. it had been interpreted by the PSC to allow 200 feet or even more, when the legislation itself only required 100 feet. So the Public Service Commission is taking steps to review that and to bring it back to the statutorily required minimum of 100 feet, which is good. I think there's also opportunity for improving even more and paring it back to zero, but that would need to be done with legislation. And then there are other things that would be really helpful. So policies supporting non-pipeline alternatives and encouraging utilities to implement non-pipeline alternatives. And these don't just have to be electrification. They can be all sorts of other things, including energy efficiency. They can even include trucked fuel, just for if you've got a customer who's, for whatever reason, just can't or won't get off of the gas system, for a short time, you can truck in fuel instead of maintaining a really expensive piece of infrastructure or replacing it, and then keeping it in the rate base for the life of the asset, which is, not going to be the engineering life of that asset. Those pipes have lifetimes upwards of 60 years, and we're much closer to 2050 than that. Those assets need to be out of rate base.
Can you explain the 100-foot rule? What is that?
Yeah, well, the 100-foot rule is a lay term. In the New York Code's Rules and Regulations, Part 230, there is a requirement on the utilities to extend from current mains up to 100 feet. And that is, there are some provisions related to whether it's in the public right of way or not. And so in some ways it's been interpreted more in favor of extending the system. At one point that might have made sense. The state was at one time trying to get people off of dirtier fuels like oil and coal and whatnot. That's no longer really the primary factor here. And now it's the continued interpretation of this statute in a way that allows many more connections than probably would be economically viable if the applicant was going to shoulder the whole cost of it. It's continuing to encourage the gas system to expand. So basically, by requiring the utilities to provide these allowances to applicants to get onto the gas system, one of the aspects of that is that the cost of connecting those applicants, so that includes digging the trenches, whatever is under there, and laying the new pipe and laying the services, that cost is shouldered by all ratepayers, all existing ratepayers. So it provides a really strong incentive for new customers to connect to the system. And it's also very much in line with the utilities' interests, business interests, by encouraging new business and encouraging the sales that come with that new business.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really interesting. I mean, it sounds like this analysis is all about the state of New York, but we know that the rules differ a lot from one state to another. And this consumer protection variance worries me a lot, given that, as you said, it would be great if we could get the most vulnerable customers off gas sooner. We know that's not going to happen in every state. And it sounds like a bitter fight coming up, right?
It's a difficult fight. And I have to say that the utilities seem to have a lot more manpower or human power making their arguments than we do. On the other hand, commissions are really starting to wake up to the challenges that we're facing. So, I feel like we've just been beating a drum for a number of years and really just trying to get the message out and make sure that it's clear and that people understand what's coming if we continue on our current trajectory. I talked about this earlier. This is showing the economics of three types of households. So there's with no electrification in red, partial electrification, which is in line with the clean energy vision scenario, and then full electrification, which is blue. And you can see that in just a couple of years, I believe that's 2026, that, or maybe 2027, that we're looking at parity between these three scenarios. This one is for Keyspan Brooklyn Union, but we did a similar analysis looking at Niagara Mohawk, which is upstate New York. So the economics are going to be a little bit different. But this is looking at total energy bills for Niagara Mohawk residential customers through 2050, and this is in the CEV scenario, and also in the accelerated electrification scenario. And in both of these cases, we're seeing parity between the no electrification and the full electrification coming in the low to mid 2030s.
Thanks, Alice, for being on the show.
Glad to have the opportunity to talk about it, and there's so much more to talk about at the same time.
If people watching the show wanted to learn, wanted to read the report, say, where can they find it?
Oh, they could find it on our website. Check out the link below.
Thanks for being on the show, Alice. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bruce and Jeannie. Thanks for all your good work.